the one thing about war horses that is consistent throughout the medieval period is there were never, ever enough of them. There were always edicts trying to get people to not export them out of the country. You can't take them out. You've got to keep them here. We need more, breed more. Various laws for knights that they had to, and this is in France and Italy and England as well, and Spain, is that they desperately needed this resource that there was never enough of.
Have I got a fun episode for you today? We are talking about medieval war horses, and I will introduce my guest in just a moment. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you for listening. Much appreciated. I always have to mention, like, share, subscribe, comment, restack, whatever is the thing. If I don't say it, then it's possible that people forget, and then my content just essentially gets outperformed by the algorithm, by everybody else who reminds their audience. So it's just a silly thing that you have to do when you're making content. So I appreciate your engagement and support on all of the content. Just Feudal Things is a conversational podcast about medieval history featuring subject matter experts and enthusiasts. New episodes come out on the 3rd and 17th of each month. And this episode is the 20th 20 episode, which is pretty exciting. Only releasing 2 episodes a month. That's 10 straight months now. We're reaching double digits. So a big, exciting episode for you here today. As always, the link to my Substack will be in the description, where you can subscribe to my free Substack and you will get more medieval history content in your life. However, if you prefer X, the link to my X is also down below. And the Substack is free. You will get more medieval content there. You'll get access to the episodes a day early. And if you're really enjoying the podcasts, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. This podcast is sponsored by me, and your support will help me to produce bigger and better projects, to continue doing medieval history and putting it out there, and revitalizing an interest and enthusiasm in medieval history and great, epic, heroic stories. If you listened to the previous episode, you heard at the end a lot of the episodes that I have coming up. And you may think to yourself, that sounds very scattered. You have a lot of different episodes about a lot of different topics. And that's fair. And I do. And aside from the fact that, of course, I want to learn about all kinds of different things myself, but I feel like it helps to bring a robust knowledge, understanding, and interest into looking at the medieval period. If you understand these little facets, a little bit about how medieval music was, if you understand a little bit about how feudalism really worked, if you understand a little bit about these various subjects, in addition to biographies or a particular story about a crusade or some event, it sort of helps to paint, in my opinion, a more robust picture of the period. And while it's, of course, very difficult to get into the medieval mind and really understand the world that they saw and they experienced, I feel like these little vignettes and little aspects of their lives really help to round out the picture, if you will. And so today is going to be another one of those episodes, which I think is really interesting. We're going to be talking about medieval war horses. And my guest today is Dr. Emma Herbert-Davies. She is a historian specializing in medieval horses with a focus on warfare, veterinary care, and the human-equine relationship. Emma has trained and competed horses for much of her life, bringing a unique perspective to the study of how horses shaped and were shaped by medieval society. She's got a new book out, which is based on her very unique and recent PhD work she just completed recently. And the link for that you will also find in the description, as well as links to her social media accounts. So feel free to follow her if you would like some more medieval horse-related content in your life, which I would recommend. So without further ado, episode 20, War Horses. Let's get into it. All right, so everybody loves a good conspiracy theory. And in my brief research for this conversation, I feel like maybe I will have unearthed a new conspiracy theory, and maybe I can get your opinion on this. It seems like right now, if you asked anybody who is man's best friend, they would say a dog. But it seems like from my understanding of medieval history, that there was a point in time, maybe for all of medieval history, maybe prior, and maybe even some sense, that the horse would have been considered the man's best friend. Is that a fair estimation? Did dogs stage a coup? What exactly happened to the horse? Or is that not real? Were dogs always man's best friend?
Oh, that is a very good question. I think dogs were always man's best friend, but the horse was the most useful animal that he had. We don't really get any signs in the literature or manuscript images of direct friendship between horses and humans, but they proliferate throughout all the manuscripts of the period. There are always horses.
All right, I guess the conspiracy theory is over. That was a quick one. Dogs win.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. No, I mean, I needed to get your expert opinion, so that's totally fair.
Yeah.
They're not man's best friend, but they're very useful. So how one of the things that you had mentioned is how would a knight get a horse? And that is something that I think, I don't know, I'm unfamiliar with. How would a knight get a horse?
Well, he had two options. He could either buy one, and he could buy one from overseas if he had the money, and employ foreign agents to buy them for him. He could go to fairs and get them. There were independent horse dealers, particularly the large towns like York and London, that he could buy them from. His other alternative was to breed them. Knights had land. It made sense. They'd have a few extra horses, and that they would breed the horses that they'd need for themselves and for their retainers, and to work on the estates as well.
So also in a little bit of my research, it's my understanding that your expertise is on the era of Edward I, Edward II, and sort of their, is it upscale breeding programs? Is that?
Yeah, that's right. So what we're doing, we're looking at sort of 1272 to 1327, and it's a period of about 50 years of Edward I and Edward II's reign that I felt, when I started to research horses, really encapsulated this idea of the warhorse, and it was a peak in warhorse production. It really tailed off afterwards for various reasons. But there were some extraordinary things happening, particularly under Edward I. And that was that he embarked on a program of breeding, and it was principally to get himself warhorses, because there was a shortage of warhorses everywhere at this point. And he ran it on an almost industrialized scale. And so we have all the documents in the National Archives in Kew in London, and these are the administrative accounts that were raised by these studs, and they suddenly appear, and every single stud had to submit quarterly and annual accounts and document exactly how much they'd spent on fodder and how many mares they had and how many foals and which stallions were there. And this went on all the way through Edward I's reign and Edward II as well. These accounts survive extant, which means we can get hold of them from about 1282 up to the 17th century. And nobody had really looked at them, partly because they're written in Latin and they're all in manuscript form. So I decided to use those as the basis for looking at war horses in England just during this particular time.
So I saw in another talk that you gave a picture of what looked like the scrolls. Is that did you go through those? Is that the those are the Latin manuscripts you're referring to, right?
Yeah, essentially they're called rolls because they're rolled up. They're made from parchment or vellum, which is animal skin, and they're written on quite closely in abbreviated Latin, which took me a while to learn. But I started learning that about 10 years ago, so that I could interpret these type of documents. They are incredible. Obviously, they weren't using paper or pens at the time, so it's all handwritten using specially prepared ink and quills. Not all of them have survived. And some of them are quite difficult to read. They're a bit moth-eaten, or they've got damp over time. But they've got an extraordinary amount of information, especially as I was coming at them from a horse person's perspective, because I've always had horses. So when I'm looking, and somebody had said to me, oh, don't bother looking at them. They're very dry. They're just lists of things. But if you know horses and you know what you're looking for and you start to read them, you can start to build a picture of just how important these war horses were during this time, how they were managed, some clues about how they were trained as well, and also where they're coming from. Because even though they're breeding them, there's still quite a few war horses being imported from abroad, mainly from Italy and Spain.
Mm-hmm. So what were some of the, I guess, unique observations that you discovered reading through these about, what they found, what they were doing?
Now, this is going to appeal to all the horse geeks that might be listening in. And one fundamental part of modern breaking in horses or training them is that we lunge them or we long line them. And that's a system using surcingles, which strap right around the horse's body, one or two long ropes. And we train horses with those. We get them to go around us and they get used to voice aids and learning what to do before the rider gets on board. It's a lot more technical than that, but that's a simplified overview of what lunging and long lining are. And although we use them today, nobody knows where it originated from. But what I found in these 13th century accounts is that is exactly what they were doing with war horses. With young war horses from the age of 2, they were long lining and they were lunging them. They were doing these preparatory groundwork exercises. So as I said, for all horse enthusiasts out there, it's like, oh, right, okay. It did go back. This thing that we use today to train horses actually has its roots steeped in history. And actually, I believe it goes a lot further back than that, but I'm still researching it. The other thing is that we're used to today to buying, there's so many different horse feeds on the market that you can give your horse. They're usually mixes. You can get mixes for old horses, for race horses, for just ponies that aren't doing much. In those days, when we go back hundreds of years, it was almost entirely oats that we fed to horses. Now, if you feed oats to a lot of horses, it tends to, let's say, make them a bit jumpy. They tend to sort of a little bit spooky. It's a real high energy. It's a bit like giving kids a lot of sugary sweets, put it like that. But that's what they had in those days. That's what they used. So these horses are getting, especially war horses, large quantities of oats. And that also reflects this amount of oats that they're feeding them, just how hard they were worked. Because you've got to remember as well, there's no cars in those days. The only form of transport you've got apart from walking is a horse, whether it's pulling a cart or you're riding on it. So people were very used to seeing horses around them and to using horses. We don't tend to use horses like that today, of course. We still have working horses on ranches, for example, but most of them are for recreational use. It was very different in the medieval period, and especially when they were being used on campaign.
Speaking of going on campaign, I heard you say something in one of your lectures about how when they traveled, they probably would have ridden on a different horse and then saved the war horse for the raid or the trebuchet or for jumping on battle or something like that. So they had different horses for different tasks. Is that right?
That's right. And it does come up in some of the documents. And to be quite honest, it makes sense that you would save your best horse by leading it rather than riding it and just mounting it when you either needed it for a raid or you were going into battle. And there are lots and lots of different horse types during this time. They weren't breeds like we have today, which are all regulated and have recorded bloodlines, but they were referred to by many different types. So the horse you're talking about, and the horse that most people talk about or think about when they think of a medieval knight on a horse, is the destrier. And that was commonly thought of as the only knight's horse. And I don't know about you, but growing up, I had this image of a knight on this enormous destrier, usually white. And that's what knights rode to battle. Whereas in reality, There were several different types of horses used in warfare. Destriers only made up a very tiny percentage of horses that went to war. There were many other types of horses used as well, depended on how much money you had and what your rank was.
That's very interesting. One of my favorite little anecdotes is from one of the prime Italian Normans, Richard of Aversa, who the chronicle writes that he was famous for riding a horse so short that his feet almost touched the ground, which kind of gave me a little bit of a different perspective on maybe how big the horses actually were.
Yes, I've come across that one as well about his feet touching the ground. Seems a little bit improbable, really. I think perhaps it might depend on the agenda of the person that was actually writing that. I mean, the size of medieval war horses, we've got a lot to blame the Victorians for. One of them was for perpetuating this myth that they were these huge, giant shire horses. And then more recently, there's been a team from the University of Exeter who've brought out a book on war horses, and they measured a lot of horse bones found in ditches outside urban centres like London, and took the mean value, which skews results somewhat, and said that, oh no, they're all little ponies. They're only 13 hands high. So suddenly we swung from one end of the pendulum to the other. Giant horses, tiny ponies that these knights were riding. My research shows that actually it was in the middle. It was somewhere in the middle. And these war horses, whether they're destriers or the other types of horses like the Roundseas and equine that they were taking on campaign, were a variety of sizes. And it's my belief that they went probably from around 14 hands up to 16 hands, which is not as big as, say, a mounted police horse. It's a small horse that, in modern terms, but it's a horse nonetheless. Certainly not that your feet would be dragging on the floor if you were riding them.
Okay. Yeah, that's a funny anecdote. I guess I hadn't considered that maybe Malaterra had maybe a slanderous intention when he was writing that. I guess maybe since he was writing for the Hautevilles.
I can talk a bit more about these horses they took on campaign.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, okay then. So we do get these destriers, these war horses that tend to be hideously expensive, to the effect that they're only ridden by earls who have very deep pockets. And that's why there are so few of them. So what we imagine in our head of this great big powerful war horse ridden by a knight, they probably only made up about 2% of the horses actually taken on campaign. One of the most expensive I found was owned by Hugh Despenser, and he paid £80 for it. And to give you a sort of comparative, that's a lifetime's wages for an average labourer of the time. They're incredibly expensive horses. Most knights rode horses that were simply called equi, which is the Latin for horse. Doesn't really give you much description. Underneath them, the squires, the men who were aspiring to be knights and who made up the bulk of the cavalry regiments under Edward I and II, they rode horses that were called in the inventories as Roundseas. And you could pick one up for around about £8. So there's a big difference in pricing. And it really did depend on your status and your pockets. What was the difference between these horses? Why would a destrier be £80 and a Roundseas only be £8? We don't know exactly, but what I think is that there's a lot coming down to how the horse is trained, and also perceptions of what was quality, whether it came from abroad or not. These destriers were certainly, in fact, it's probably not quite true just to call them war horses. They were specialist combat horses. They were using them in tournaments as well as for war. They could use the same horse for both. And I've got evidence of that, of the Prince Edward buying 19 destriers, and he wanted to take them to a tournament and then have a bit of fun with them and then take them up into Scotland. And they were breeding from these horses as well. What made them different from other horses was probably the way they looked. And the reason we know that is because it was a real thing in these days, is that if you were a paid man-at-arms riding on one of the king's campaigns, you could get your warhorse insured, just like we get horses insured today. And that meant that at muster, when everybody grouped at the start of the campaign, the king's officials would look at your horse. They would go, right, that's a destrier. So they could tell by sight, or it's a Roundsie, or it's an equine. We reckon it's worth this much. So if it dies or it falls sick, we will pay you compensation and we will decide the value of them. So Hugh Dispenser, yes, gosh, that's an impressive destrier. That's £80. And then perhaps the rest of his retinue was roughly between sort of £8 and £20. So they knew when they were looking at horses that these destriers look different to your average horse in England. And because we know that quite a lot of them came from abroad, from France, from Spain, and from Italy, what we think is that they probably looked more like Spanish horses today. They were short, they were compact, they were really built athletically, and that's what you needed from a war horse. If you're routing the enemy or you're fighting, you need a highly trained horse that can get you out of trouble, can turn and twist on a sixpence for you. And that's what made these horses so expensive. It'd have been nice to have owned one.
So is maybe the comparison a little bit like a Porsche to a Ferrari? Like in terms of performance, the performance is probably pretty negligible. Of course, a Ferrari is going to go a lot faster, or whatever, but it's really about like the status and the appearance and sort of the how out of reach a Ferrari is for somebody to own in a way that gives you that sort of extra boost, if you will.
Yeah, I would say so. It's like parking your Lamborghini next to a Ford Escort. And of course, people are going to know the difference. But the one thing also about these is that they're as much a symbol of status as anything. So you've got the Earl and you've got the Earls and the Kings riding these destriers as well. And I think as much as anything, it says something about their power and about their status. We don't get Earls on Roundsies. We don't get them sort of riding any sort of horse. What they rode said a lot about them. And we make these assumptions today. Somebody gets out of a Ferrari, you instantly make an assumption, they're either powerful or they're very, very rich. So that was an important part, was to be seen as well on the right kind of horse in battle.
Right. So if a young lord rode up to your place in a Roundsie, and then a few years later he rode up in a destrier, you'd think like, oh, this guy's come up. His stuff's kind of successful now.
In fact, we see that in the records. So we'll get some people in the Welsh Wars in the around about 1280, and then we see them at Falkirk 10 years later, and you can see it. In fact, Andrew Ayton did a wonderful study of this in the 1990s, looking at the horse inventories, and he was able to trace the social composition of armies by seeing how their horses improved as they made their way in the world. So yeah, that was a thing. Mm-hmm.
And how did Edward how was there a shortage of horses, I suppose, at the beginning of his reign? If dudes are just sort of breeding their own horses, and there's, I guess, horse merchants and horse dealers, if you will, how did there become a horse shortage that then started?
Well, I think sort of, they say that necessity is the mother of invention. And Edward's father had died in left behind quite a financial mess, and you need quite a lot of money to run studs and produce war horses. So it wasn't until they really needed them that they realised that no one had really put the effort in the last sort of few decades to make sure there were war horses. And this was something that Edward I was really keen to address. So on the outbreak of the first hostilities with Wales, what do his nobles do? Oh, we're going to war. We're going to battle. We've got to look good. We need these horses. There aren't any. So they sent all their agents to France, which had the Champagne fairs. This was a big network of fairs, attracting international traders, well known for selling war horses as well. And they imported about 250 of these war horses straight over from France, brought them to Wales, so they could use them in warfare there. A few years later, they tried the same thing when hostilities broke out. They tried to get horses from France. The French king went, no way, Jose, you're not taking any more war horses out of my country because I need them as well. And that's when this breeding operation started. So Edward I says, right, okay, anybody holding more than 30 liberates of land has to keep a war horse at the ready. So he's putting the onus on his nobles. For heaven's sake, start either buying or breeding your own horses. And then, almost so that hoping perhaps that his nobles would follow his example, that's when he revitalized all of the royal studs. And he would have put quite a lot of money into that, into breeding and producing. And essentially what he was doing was making a factory for war horses. He was making sure that he was never going to be short again. And that was quite prudent, because then, of course, he starts having many, many years of hostilities with the Scots. And there was a huge demand for war horses throughout that time, mostly because the attrition rate was pretty high for them anyway. So they constantly needed replacements all the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, tell me about that, the attrition rate. And we'll get into this because I sent you the post on Twitter about training horses and horses running into lines of spears and all that stuff. What was that like in Battle for the Horses? And I totally disagree with that post that these horses were trained to smash straight through infantry ranks. That was not the purpose of a cavalry charge. The purpose of a cavalry charge was to face an undisciplined infantry force, bear down on them, and almost the psychological impact of having these horses or these horsemen pounding down at you would break up the infantry. And once you'd broken them up, that's when your cavalryman came into play, because he can twist and turn on these horses and he can rout the enemy and cut them down as they're in pandemonium and they're fleeing. If you ran your cavalry straight through a disciplined rank of infantry, now at Falkirk, William Wallace got his Scottish infantry into a formation and made them stand firm with their pikes facing outwards. That could not be broken. The suggestion that these horses were used to break through ranks like that is preposterous, because one, it's suicide. Two, it achieves little apart from killing knights and killing horses, and you're losing some of your most valuable assets that way. So what happened at Falkirk, when the infantry would not break, they had to wheel round, they had to pull up at the last minute and turn these horses. And we know that this was a practiced manoeuvre. And in fact, it goes back to the 12th century. We've got a written account of youths in London practicing this manoeuvre of riding in cavalry units and circling away from other cavalry units. So we knew that basically it's a bluff. We'll bear down on you. You're not very disciplined, because there's no standing armies at the time. So you've got everybody there with a scythe or a pike or what have you, and that they would break. And once you'd broken them, that was it. That they could be picked off. So it didn't work at Falkirk because the infantry held firm. But it was the archers that actually picked off the Scottish schiltrons and made them disperse. That's when the cavalry properly got to work. So cavalry is very good against other cavalry. Cavalry is very good for when infantry have dispersed, coming round the flanks of armies, picking people off, routing the enemy, and also for using for raids like chevauchés as well, where you could send out parties of men to damage your enemy's infrastructure. Certainly under Edward I and II, crack troops were put together of these horses to go and hunt down some of the Scottish leaders as well. But so no, it did not make sense, and we have no records of cavalry horses actually smashing through lines of disciplined infantry. Yeah, that's been my read of it as well, that it's mostly, I guess, undisciplined forces that cavalry works best on. And it seems like there's a little bit of a paper, rock, scissors kind of thing that's going on with, sort of like, I guess, spearmen, archers, and cavalry, where they sort of each work well against each other, and you kind of want to have the right one deployed at the right time or use it against the proper, whatever you're facing, you want to, if you're facing rock, you want to use paper or whatever is the case.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and every battle would have been different. Although remember, battles were actually few and far between. Anyway, it's not that if people get this sort of sense that medieval battles were all people lining up on a battlefield and going at it with each other, it did not happen very often at all. And the period I'm writing about, which is this use of heavy cavalry and heavy cavalry squadrons, really started to fall out of use. Really after Bannockburn, and that's when cavalry charges failed again. And by the time we get to places like Crusade, they're relying on war horses as for chevauchés, for sort of crack mounted troops, rather than cavalry charges. I think they realised that the efficiency of especially longbowmen on horses. So at Crusade we have the cavalry coming down towards the archers, and the archers really decimating the troops. I did some experiments actually with a longbow archer to work out how much protection, because these horses were called covered, and this term covered meant that it had to have some protection, and that was one of the inclusions of serving for pay, is you had to have a covered horse. So it would have pieces of leather or mail or padding or combinations of both. Perhaps some small pieces of plate that were starting to come in as well to protect your horse. One reason for this is because they were insuring these horses, so they wanted to make sure that they were mitigating any insurance claims as well. But David Jones, who's a longbow expert, and I collaborated with mail and padding, which was used mostly at that time, especially for horse armor, to see was it effective against arrows or not. And the conclusion we came up with was that it was not entirely effective, and horses were still left very, very vulnerable. You'd have to put so much padding underneath this mail to stop an arrow penetrating a horse. I mean, it depended on the shot and the range and what have you, and the trajectory of the arrow. But to entirely proof it, you'd have to put so much on a horse that it probably physically would struggle to carry that kind of weight, or it would overheat. And that was a big thing. And David Jones, I think he was designing vests for the military, protective vests for the military. And one of the things they had to really think about was the thermal dynamics of this. So you put a lot of padding underneath mail, you're going to end up getting a hot and exhausted horse. So it helped, but it didn't solve the problem.
So is it sort of like the English longbowmen kind of saw the horse off the field? Is that it sort of entered the decline of the heavy cavalry?
I think there was a lot of changes going on at this time in military tactics. Andrew Ayton does consider that the use of longbows, which is essentially sort of long-range warfare, isn't it? It's great if you can pick your enemies off before they come anywhere near you. We can see parallels with that today as well. But the use of these longbowmen did change the way that cavalry was being used. And I think that especially after cavalry charges like Bannockburn not working, and the expense of maintaining these cavalry troops as well, it did start to shift. I mean, war, as you know yourself, military warfare develops all the time. But yes, the true warhorse per se that we think of charging towards infantry really started to shift and go out of favour over the 14th century.
So one of the questions, I guess, that I have maybe for what is what you would consider like peak warhorse period is how much of an actual performance advantage would a warhorse have actually been, between, let's say, those, the equines or the rounceys versus those high-end destriers or whoever. What would actually, because you mentioned that there's not a whole lot of difference between them. So would it have made much of a difference at all, or was that mostly a status thing?
Good question. I think it's mostly a status thing. But I do think these destriers, part of their price was linked to the fact that they were very, very highly trained. The squires on the rounceys, on the other hand, maybe they'd simply done a bit of training themselves with their horses, or in order to, before they actually went on campaign. So I think, so performance-wise, you want a Destra if you want the best horse in battle. But a round C is going to be adequate. It's going to be adequate for you. And they must have all had some level of training, because you cannot just take a horse onto a battlefield. I mean, I've had horses all my life, so we train them for kind of various things, but you need to train a horse to carry a rider holding a weapon. Horses don't generally respond terribly well to seeing things suddenly come into their line of sight. So I practiced with various weapons on a horse to see what the reaction was for them, and thought, yes, definitely they need to be trained for this as well. But it's also the chaos of a battlefield as well. It's trying to keep a horse riding in formation. It's really important that the horse will do as it's told, or as you want it to. So training was really important. I think tournaments and hunting were probably used a lot as well to train these horses for battle.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, actually, at the end there with the tournaments and the hunting, that those things were very much a part of the warrior culture, as much as the war was, for preparation, for status, for spending time with your other nobles, for all of those things. So one of the other things that my own research has sort of led me to is how the heavy cavalry charge is portrayed in media as sort of this, giant melee. Everybody's just running as fast as they can, and this, that, and the other. But in real life, the cavalry charge, they would have, at least the Normans, as I understand it, but I think this is probably true of most other ones, they would have been in a formation. So you would have been riding essentially right next to somebody. It would have been all in a similar formation. And so for that sort of thing, you don't necessarily need, you don't need the fastest horse if you're riding in formation, for example, right? Mm-hmm. You need a well-trained horse.
Yeah, you need a well-trained horse that isn't going to go, well, hey, this is a race, I'm going to get. Because the minute your formation starts to break, it loses its impact. And in fact, we get these from some of the writings from wars much later on, from the wars of the 19th century, like Argent du Pic, who was a captain, who was talking about how his cavalrymen struggled to control their horses as they were trying to keep information, because horses naturally try to outpace each other, so they'll just get faster and faster. And he recommended that the best way to perform a cavalry charge was you start at a walk, then you trot, and then you canter, and you only gallop really the last few yards. It's got to be graduated, and part of that is so that you can all keep together and also keep control of your horses as well. So yeah, they'd have ridden in formation.
That's really interesting. I hadn't even thought about the psychology of the horses trying to outpace each other. It's very funny.
Yes. I've been in that situation, not in a cavalry charge, but I've done quite a lot of team events, team chasing and hunting, and where you need to sort of keep in some kind of formation. I've done the hunt rides as well, where there's been about 40 of us setting off towards the first fence. And everybody knows that you've got a 3-mile race ahead of you with a lot of jumps. So you think, I've got to conserve my horse's energy. And those horses, once that flag goes or once that horn's down, that's it. And they pull really, really hard, because they're all like, yeah, this is so exciting. This is a race. I'm going to be first to this jump. Let me take you. So it's you have to train a horse or you have to know your horse quite well as well, or be a very good rider as well, and know what bit to put it in, to be able to keep it under control in excitable moments like that. Hunting is very, very good for teaching horse, for doing this with horses as well, because that way that they learn to respond to you. They learn to keep their feet as well over uneven ground. And I think that would have been particularly useful for war horses.
One of the things that surprised me in doing a little research for this was that the horse is not considered ready for war until he's about 5 years old.
Yes, I looked at the stud accounts, and the great thing about them is you can trace the trajectory of horses around the studs and see what's being bought for them and see the equipment that's being bought for them as well. So we've got colts on the studs, and most of these horses, especially that they're pulling off the royal studs, which are for use of the king and also to give to his members of, his family and his earls and what have you. They were colts. They were male horses. They were kept in bachelor groups after they'd been weaned, and from about the age of 2 to 2.5, you start to see equipment being bought for them. So they're haltered. They've got these, what I was talking about, the long lines and the surcingles. So they're having groundwork done with them. And then at the age of, after about 6 months of this, and they're about 3 years old, they've moved into the royal stables where they kind of disappear. And because they're mixed up with all the other horses, but they are referred to as foals, as pulley, and not till as destriers or coursers or equi or whatever they end up being until they are 5 years old. And that suggests that they were still seen to be immature until that age. So you have a horse that starts roughly around the age of 2 and has approximately 3 years of training before it's ready to go on campaign. It's still a novice horse. It's good to take them out and to test them. Perhaps they've been in tournaments where they're getting used to having a mounted rider with a weapon and the noise of the crowds and what have you. And in fact, the one thing about warhorse training that we do know, if we look at veterinary treatises that talk about a little bit about horse training, and they say, take your horse into the city, especially around where blacksmiths are working. Because obviously that implies that they'll hear the clanging of metal. And so they'll get used to that sound. And a little later, another one writes, take your horse past slaughterhouses so it gets used to the smell of blood. So there's all this habituation, getting these horses used to these different scenarios, and then hoping that if you do go to warfare and you end up in a skirmish or you end up in a battle, you'll have a horse that goes, oh no, I'm used to all this. I've been trained. I'll ignore it. I'll listen to my rider. I'm not going to bolt in fear. Did this work all the time? Probably not. You still get, I think probably all horse people will resonate with this, is that you can train a horse really well, take it out to its first competition, and it doesn't perform as you expect. It's all a little bit overwhelming. And we have this account of Edward I at the Battle of Falkirk at the eve of it, and he calls for his war horse. And it's so excited because it can hear the trumpets calling everybody to battle, that it kicks him and breaks 2 of his ribs. So even though the king can afford the best horses and the best trained horses, things didn't always go quite to plan.
Wow. And so that sort of ties in actually to this shortage of horses, because if they're not ready till they're 5, then you need a 5-year lead up to when you need the horse, basically. So if you have a shortage, that's essentially like a 5-year shortage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't take them younger. They might have done it if there was a real shortage. 5 years is the maximum. The king's got the luxury to have this rolling stock of horses being bred. Some of them might have been younger, or some of them might have even been older when they took them. But that's certainly the premium age to take them. And I traced one horse, which I reckon must have been about 5 in the Welsh Wars. And so he'd been taken to war as a 5-year-old. And actually, I find him over 10 years later as standing at stud as a stallion, which showed that he had probably a 10-year career before he was retired to stud. Saying that, if we go back to attrition rates, an awful lot of horses died, obviously, on these campaigns. And we see this in all wars, don't we? We've seen it, especially in World War I as well, where we had something like 2 million horses lost. And I did find that most of the horses that were dying on campaign were dying not in battle, but actually from exposure and exhaustion. That was a real problem. Lack of food. Because if there's one thing the Scots were great at, it was guerrilla warfare and hitting supply trains. So, of course, you hit your enemy's supply trains, your enemy suffers. So we have accounts of men starving in garrisons and eating their war horses and claiming insurance for them as well. We have that in Wales and in Scotland. And we also have accounts of people desperately saying, we're in a garrison or we're here, we've got nothing for the horses to eat. And basically it was a case of, well, you're going to have to wait till we get somewhere. On one particular case, I think in 1301, they overwintered in Scotland, the King's army, and he lost almost half his horses. And in fact, he was also crying out for supplies, not so much for his soldiers, but for his horses. He was like, we need hay, I need oats for my horses, I need to feed my horses. So we had a 50% death rate there. If we look at the Battle of Falkirk, which we have really good statistics for, we have, as I said, all these horses are insured. So lists were written of the man who brought the horse to be insured, description of his horse and its value. And these were in great big log rolls, and they were carried on campaign. So whenever a horse died or felt sick, you could cross him off the list. And then you put a note beside saying what the horse had died of or where. So we can see the attrition rate of horses, not only on campaign, but actually in that Battle of Falkirk as well, where they did employ cavalry. So we've got on these rolls, and these are only paid men at arms, doesn't include the retinues that are there, the lords that perform in their feudal service without pay. So we've probably got about 40% of the cavalry turning up. And there's about 3,200 horses. And roughly about 20% of those died on the battlefield. The destriers took the hardest hit. 20% of the destriers died. Then the equi, and then the roundseas. And that's kind of the order of your formation. So you've got the highest rank in the front, leading on these specialist combat horses. Then you've got their knights behind them, and then you've got the bulk of your cavalry, the squires on their horses. And the attrition rates, as I said, show that it's the destriers must have been at the front because they really took a hammering. So I think probably all in all, that one particular battle, if we include an estimate of the horses that aren't mentioned, of the retinues that are serving without pay, we're probably losing 250, 300 horses dead on that battlefield. But as I said, more are lost through either injuries, sickness, exhaustion was a big thing, or exposure. I mean, saying that though, they tried their absolute best to look after these horses. And I think in that sense, they did care about them, but sort of in relation to themselves, because they aren't pets. They are there to do a job. But if a horse fell sick, they had horse doctors that you could send it to. And in fact, horses were evacuated in small groups as well, regularly out of Scotland at this time and taken down to York. So they weren't just writing them off. They were doing everything they could to fix these horses, mend them, try and give them rest. We have one garrison where the soldiers refused to go out on a sortie to repel these bands of Scots because they said the horses were too tired. Now, whether their horses were too tired, it's just that they didn't want to go out, I don't know. But it does show that the exhaustion was a thing. We also get people who are these knights writing letters to the king, basically because they hadn't been paid, obviously. It was quite hard to get any money out of the king. And there was one in particular, and I mentioned this in another interview I did for Jason Kingsley, where this knight, he's fought on the English side. He's got estates in Scotland. They've all been taken off him by the Scots as well. He's destitute. He's got a wife and 10 children. He says are reduced to begging on the streets. They are starving. Oh, but by the way, my lord, I kept my war horse. And he's still got his war horse, even though apparently his children are starving and his wife's begging on the street. Does that show that he had this bond with his war horse that he couldn't bear to part with it? That's a possibility. does it show perhaps that he's saying, look, you can, I can still work for you. You can still pay me because I've got the essential thing, the one thing that is needed that qualifies me as a knight, my horse. Perhaps it's a mixture of both.
Yeah, it was partly hearing that story is where I came up with the horse man's best friend conspiracy theory from. Maybe, and I have another question for you. Maybe you can give me your more expert opinion on. I'm a little confused when I study medieval battles, and because of my loose understanding of this, you have the knight, and then he's attended by his squire or squires, and then there'll be a record of, let's say, 1,000 cavalry. Does that number of 1,000 include the squires, or is that 1,000 knights? Is that,
That's 1,000 knights. Well, I suppose it's going to depend which battle and what sources you are looking at. Sources always differ. It depends who's written it about exactly how many people are there. When if I go back to the Falkirk, the battle in Scotland between Edward I and William Wallace, the Braveheart one, that we have all the original documents for. It's very well documented. There are 3,200, and I think the exact number is something like 42. So 3,242 men on horses that are paid to fight. They will have also had their attending squires as well. They'd have had to take all their kit with them. So they've got their pavilions, they've got their everything from their cooking pots to their weapons as well. So you have this, each earl or each banneret is going to have his own little retinue. I tried to work out how many horses turned up for that muster, for that grouping before they all moved en masse into Scotland. And I worked out probably at least 10,000 horses in total, and roughly a third of which would have been war horses. The rest are baggage animals. They're for the squire. We could go back to the fact that they probably weren't riding their best war horses. They would be riding another horse, and that one of their servants would be leading their war horse, conserving its energy for the job proper. That's a lot of horses.
Well, so that leads into my next question. I'm going to throw you maybe a little bit of a curveball, because in some discussions that I've seen theoretically about Mongols invading Europe, there's sort of these discussions about, the Mongols, if they hit, if Genghis Khan hadn't died, they'd have invaded, they'd have taken over Europe, or this, that, and the other. But the Mongols, I've seen some videos on this. The Mongols had, let's say, an army of 50,000. That would have been 250,000 horses, roughly, with this army, which sounds logistically difficult. Maybe you can talk about the logistical difficulty or impossibility of how many horses would be feasible, or does that make that's just sort of something I hear all the time, but it's obviously a logistical question that nobody takes into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, that's a squirrely question. How many horses is it feasible? It depends on the time of year. It depends on the terrain as well. And I have read, I'm no expert on the Mongols, but I have read about their baggage trains being like 10 miles long. There's even chroniclers talk about Edward I's baggage train and extending into the distance as far as the eye can see. Horses need three things. They need feeding, and they need more than just grass. I mean, they did take with them on campaign falcatores, which were men whose only job was to cut grass for the horses with a sickle. But you can't just let your horses graze in the open or in the nearby fields when you're on campaign, especially if you're in enemy territory, because, hey, the enemy's going to go and pinch them anyway. So they're going to need hard feed like oats. They need a really energy-rich diet. They also need access to water. It's probably not a problem in Scotland because it rains a lot there anyway, which actually went against them at times and made them suffer quite a bit. We have chroniclers talking about it raining so much that even the leather harness on the horses rotted, and they couldn't and they were forced to eat twigs and bits of trees. They were all starving men and horses. So yes, it really depends on the terrain and the conditions, so the weather as well. Basically, I'm in a roundabout way, I'm saying there isn't a single answer for this, but the logistics were always a problem. And I think you'll probably find, looking in most wars, that logistics, never mind of feeding the men, feeding the animals the animals always had to come second by necessity, because you needed your soldiers. So yes, as I've said, in Edward the First and Second, during their campaigns, particularly in Scotland, they really struggled to get enough fodder for the horses, and often struggled to get fodder for the men as well. And you need to shoe these horses, don't forget, as well. And I mean, they've got 4 feet, every horse. You've got thousands of them. So they took a lot of prefabricated horseshoes with them, and stacked them in barrels and took those, and tens of thousands of horseshoe nails, so they could nail the shoes back on if they got sucked off in the mud. But perhaps also, perhaps that's also one of the reasons why we see this slight drop in cavalry being one of the primary sort of on the battlefield as well, is that it's terribly hard to keep these horses going on a campaign. But they've also got their assets as well. You're so much more mobile on a horse, aren't you?
Well, and for the Mongols, yeah, I mean, they were all about horse archery, so they needed the mobility. And so your book was published earlier this year. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about maybe a little synopsis, or some of the things that you explore in the book.
Yeah. So this book was based on a PhD I did at the University of Leeds, and being a horse lover and somebody interested in the medieval period as well, it was kind of natural that I decided to look at medieval war horses. And I had my thesis basically published as a book. It's called The War Horse in England, 1272 to 1327, which are the reigns of Edward I and II, just to remind people. And it's available by Trivent and on Amazon, etc. And really, it kind of goes into more detail about what we've been discussing today. So I look at the horses that were taken on campaign by Edward I and Edward II. And this is a time of sort of almost continuous conflicts in England. So it was a really right time to look at their use of horses. So I talk about how these horses are bred, where they came from overseas, and who was actually importing these horses. I talk about the whole stud network, about the breeding of horses on these studs, as well as the training of these colts. I also look at how the armour that they used for these horses and whether they were effective. And I look at what happened to these horses on campaign. It's not just attrition rates. It's again, like you said, the logistics of looking after them and how they were cared for. And really, I think I wrote it mostly because we knew so little about war horses in that period, well, for most of the medieval period, but particularly in that period. And I wanted to give some context to actually taking these horses on campaign and what it was like. And the most extraordinary things I was finding was the huge networks put in place to try and support taking these horses on campaign, not just administrative, but also, as you said, with making sure that they were supplied with shoes, with fodder, and with horse doctors as well to look after them. But it's all in my book.
Fantastic. And we'll have a link to that in the description. If you'd like to go check out her book, you can find it there. And I'll leave you with the last word here as we wrap up. If there's anything else, I'm definitely the layman here who, prior to this conversation, really had not considered at all the advantage of war horses or their impact or the logistics, really, of the war horses in medieval battles and even in medieval life. So if there's anything else that you would like to leave the listeners with, as far as anything they should consider about war horses or even just horses in the medieval period, I'll leave you with the last word.
I think probably I can pull out the couple of things that really struck me when I did this research was that horses were such an enormous presence in medieval life, even from the humble plough horse up to the war horse. And they were incredibly important, not just as one of status symbols as well, but also on campaign. And these horses were taken on campaign, not just in their thousands, but their tens of thousands. And their lives were really shaped by human conflict. But that enormous amounts of resources were put into looking after these horses. So they were cared for. They were valued, probably beyond, I think, their monetary value as well. But also, one thing I really wanted to debunk was this myth of the knights riding into battle on great big white Shire horses, because they came in a variety of sizes, and a huge variety of colours as well.